edu-profiling, the sort of assessment system that I do, it's very, very different from a normal educational assessment, because what we're looking for is not what's wrong with somebody, but what's special about them. We're looking to find where they're being blocked, and the aim is to release their potential. So it's not at all about fixing problems, although we may well fix problems along the way. It's all about getting at the stress factors that inhibit everybody from releasing their full potential. And it's actually a very, very exciting process, and I hope by the end of the evening you will understand just how exciting it is. So this all began a very long time ago, probably more than 30 years ago, with my own children, because my first child was a little bit different. And by the time she was 3 or 4, we began to realise we don't really understand her, and we don't really know how to answer her needs. And the school were thinking kind of the same thing as well. There was nothing wrong with her, but she was different, and she was compromising herself in order to fit in. And she had a friend who turned out to be dyslexic, and he was doing the same thing. Very different children, very different issues, but they didn't fit in with the education system, and they were feeling uncomfortable. And I got interested. In those days, people had barely heard of dyslexia. It was quite a new idea and not accepted generally. Anyway, about 25 years ago, I decided to train, to find out more. And in those days, the only training you really could do was in dyslexia. So I did a Master's of Education degree, further degree, with somebody called Professor Tim Miles, who was one of the leading figures in dyslexia research, now deceased sadly. Lovely man. And so I learned about dyslexia, and I also learned about other forms of specific learning difficulties, and also about educational assessment and evaluation, which has always been very important to me, because I think you have to make sure that any intervention techniques you're using are working. And the only way you can find that out is by testing properly and retesting, and that's been a feature of everything I've done over the last 25 years. So I thought when we started out with this programme I was fixing problems, but what I've learned over the last few years is that that's not what we're doing at all. What we're doing is we're releasing potential, and what we need to do is educate society to understand just how important that is, which is where edu-profiling and the training programme we're doing at the moment is so important. I suppose I should explain a little bit about stress before I move on. When I talk about a stress factor, what I mean is anything that is preventing a system in the body from working at its optimal level. And stress factors come in various forms. Often they're toxic. Might be a virus, an allergen, a heavy metal, a pesticide, and mostly they're inherited. Because when we're talking about neurodevelopment, the factors that have influenced neurodevelopment have come on very early, usually before the child's born. Not so much happens afterwards. It's usually what's happened before birth, which is the most important thing. By the time a child is born, it is a whole package of other people's stress factors. For example, mother's emotions in the last 3 months of pregnancy will go on to the next 4 or 5 generations. Dad's emotions in puberty go into the sperm. Dad's toxins in puberty go into the sperm. So what Dad gets up to in puberty has a huge effect on his future offspring. And one of the problems we have with that, of course, is Dad's understanding of consequences is only really beginning to develop in puberty. And so young men are going to get up to all sorts of things. And there's not much we can do to stop them. So there's a whole load of toxic factors just passed on from those things. It's not just toxins, it's emotions. For many years, people didn't understand how emotions affect the body. They couldn't see a mechanism. But some wonderful work was done by somebody called Candice Pert, who demonstrated that emotions actually coded in the body as something called neuropeptides. And they have a massive effect on our processing, and they are also inherited. So by the time we're born, we have all of that genetic stuff everybody already knows about. We have something called epigenetic effects, which are the sort of things I've just been talking about with mum's emotions in pregnancy and what Dad gets up to in puberty. Emotional and toxic, of course. Then, of course, we have the environmental factors, radiation, geopathic stress, all that sort of thing, mobile phone mast. No, we really don't know what sort of effects those are having. We suspect they might be having a big effect. And then, of course, you have physical problems as well, like spinal alignment and brain injuries. So if you start off with an opinion, a belief system, this is who I am, this is who that child is, this is what's going to happen, you're going to block progress. And that's why we need to train people to do profiling assessments. In a conventional assessment, if a child goes to an educational psychologist or a specialist teacher for an assessment, what they will do is they will do various tests. They'll do IQ tests, which purport to show how intelligent the child is. They'll do attainment tests to show how well they read, how well they spell, etc. They may do memory tests. They may do one or two other tests. And they're going to come up with a profile of the child, and then they'll say, well, broadly, this child seems to be a bit dyslexic, or this child is having problems paying attention, maybe he's got ADHD. This is a conventional assessment. Now, what tends to happen when a parent and a child go through that experience is it's all rather negative. For one thing, it only tends to confirm what the parent knew already. The parent already knows the child is having difficulty in reading. They didn't need an educational psychologist to tell them that. The IQ is a dangerous one, because if the educational psychologist tells them, well, your 10-year-old child has an average IQ, and the belief system of the educational psychologist is that IQ doesn't change much over the years, then the parent is going to think, well, my child is only average. I'm not going to expect any more of him. That's dangerous. What we know from working with Edutherapy is that IQ is not fixed. On average, non-verbal IQ goes up by 15 standard points in a year on Edutherapy. That's one standard deviation from the mean. It's absolutely massive. Verbal IQ doesn't go up so much. It goes up by about 6 standard points, but that's because verbal IQ is very largely learned. And you can't make that gain in a year, because you need time to learn stuff. So IQ isn't fixed, but there's a belief system that it is. So if a child comes for an edu-profiling assessment, the aim of an edu-profiling assessment is not to find out what's wrong with the child, it's to find out what's special about a child. And most of these children who are presenting with problems actually are just a bit different. The stress around being different has created problems, because if you go into the school system being a bit different and you compromise yourself trying to fit in, and then however hard you try, your teacher says you're wrong, it creates even more stress factors, and you find you develop more and more difficulties. So whereas you maybe had very few problems to begin with, those problems begin to get more and more as you go through the system. So what we're looking for in an edu-profiling assessment is what's special about a child, not what's wrong with them. So it's easiest if I give you an example. Perhaps I had a boy come a little while ago. He was in trouble in school. He couldn't keep still. He couldn't keep quiet. He couldn't pay attention. He seemed pretty bright, but his reading wasn't very good. He could read the words, but he had no reading stamina. He was absolutely hopeless at getting anything down on paper. He's very good verbally, talk for England. That's an English expression you won't know. But very little got written down on paper. And he'd been in trouble in school for a while, and he was always in trouble at home because you know what it's like in the morning, getting children ready for school. He would never be at the front door with all his clothes. You'd have had to nag him for ages to get him to eat his breakfast. He wouldn't have his sports kit when he needed his sports kit. He was just a walking disaster. And, poor mum, by the time she got him to school, she needed a very strong cup of coffee. And it was like that every morning. And he was just always in trouble. And he'd come home at night and he hadn't got his books for his homework. So the child was convinced there was something wrong with him and thought he was probably a bit naughty as well. And mum was desperate. What's to become of him? Now this child, he's actually a very clever child, and he's different. He's got something special. So you start off the assessment, and when I do an assessment, the first thing I do is look at the child's IQ. So I look at the non-verbal IQ and the verbal IQ. And I can see from what this child is doing, that he's got all sorts of visual processing difficulties when he's doing the IQ test, the visual IQ test. So he's not scoring very well because he's got visual perceptual problems. When he does the verbal IQ test, he's much better because he's very good with words. His vocabulary is very good. And then we come to look at his eyes. Well, no, first of all, I get a child to read. I look at their reading. And I can see what's happening, where they're making errors. And I can see this child's making a lot of visual processing errors. He's missing out words. He's substituting one word with another that looks rather similar. He's skipping lines. Nobody really thought he got a big reading problem, but you can see when he's reading, a whole passage that he's actually got quite a big reading problem. So then we come to look at his eyes, and this is where you start turning everything around, because the child thinks he's a problem, mum thinks he's a problem. Then the first thing we do is we want to know where his eye dominance is. That's always very important when you're assessing children's visual processing. Have they got a fixed eye dominance, and which side is it? Most people have right eye dominance. That's normal. That connects up to the left-hand side of the brain, and most people are sort of left brain dominant, which is the logical side of the brain. So we have a look at this child's eye dominance, and he's left eye dominant. So we think, oh, brilliant, you're left eye dominant. You're creative. We've got a wonderful creative right brain child here. So already we're beginning to turn that child around. Perhaps there's something special about me after all. And as we go through, the next thing we do is have a look at the child's tracking, and we see that when he's tracking a moving object, he can't just use his eyes, the pupils don't just move, the whole head moves, so he's looking like this. Brilliant. He's got a problem with something called differentiation. Now, most experts have never heard of this word. And differentiation is all about the brain cells finding out what their job is. And mostly they find that out quite early. So by the time a child is 5 or 6, they can follow a moving object without the whole head moving, because the brain cells that are involved in moving the muscles of the eyeball know what their job is. So you don't get lots of overflow movements with other bits of the body. But if those brain cells haven't really sorted out exactly what their job is, then you get all sorts of other bits and pieces getting involved. And that's a child, if he can't keep his head still when he's tracking, he's not going to keep his body still when he's listening either. So when all the teachers, all the children are sitting down listening nicely to their story, when they're, well, in the UK when they're 4, they're supposed to sit still on a mat listening to a story. As soon as the teacher starts reading the story, this child starts fidgeting. Sit still. So he sits still. A minute later he's on the move again. And then the child gradually learns, well, actually, I'm going to be asked so many times, what did I just say? That I've actually, while I'm listening to the story, I've got to make sure I know exactly what this teacher just said, because she's going to ask me in a minute, because she thinks I'm not listening. But every time that child is listening, he's on the move. Because he can't just isolate the muscles that are involved in listening. There's overflow movement to his bottom, his legs, his arms. He's knocking into other people, because he doesn't really quite know where he's in space either, because that's something else that's going on. So what you explain to the child and the parent is, well, when he's concentrating, he's going to be on the move. He's not naughty. So you just have to make sure he's sitting where he's not going to interfere with the class. He can hear perfectly well, but when he's paying attention, he's going to be on the move. But it's actually a lot more exciting than that. If those brain cells haven't fully differentiated for their purpose, they can be anything they want to be. We've got a creative brain, a brain that can carry on developing when everyone else's brains have developed. They've got kind of fixed. If you're going to be creative, if you're going to do something differently from the way it's been done before, you don't want to be fixed. You want to have the ability to change. So these children have that ability to change until they find out where they're going and what's special about them and really develop that talent. They're going to be on the move because those brain cells won't be fully developed. Once you start explaining this to the child and the parent, they stop thinking, oh, I'm a problem, there's something wrong with him. Begin to think, hey, I've got something special. So instead of the parent worrying about whatever is going to become of this child, she relaxes and thinks, my job isn't to worry about the present, my job's to worry about the future in terms of how can I develop this child's talent. You've turned everything round. And I could go on, because you could spend several hours talking about this, but I see a lot of children like that. And the objective of an edu profiling assessment is to send that child after what is 3 or 4 hours, actually 4 or 5, usually with an assessment that I do, send that child skipping out of the door, feeling totally confident, knowing A, there's nothing wrong with them, B, somebody's going to help me, because you have to sort out the problems as well, and C, something special about me, I'm okay. And that's actually very important because that makes space for change, and you change all of those stress factors working on the cell membrane. Because before you had a whole load of negative influences on the expression of the DNA. And what you've done by doing a good positive assessment has completely changed that round. You've made that space for change, not only in the child but also in the parent. But the next thing is you've got to do that with the school. Because the teacher doesn't understand this child. Now, and these children are always hypersensitive. If you send a child like this into school at 4, as we do in the UK, and if they start talking when they shouldn't do, moving when they shouldn't do, getting into trouble, the teacher starts getting cross with them. And if the teacher gets cross with them, then you're going to have a lot of trouble. So it's not enough to convince the child they're okay and convince the parent they're okay, as long as they do a programme, sort out the problems. You've then got to convince the school that they're okay, they're going to be okay, and change the view of the school. You have to have a good dialogue between home and school. You have to send an assessment report into school explaining why the child can't sit still. And then you need to see that child every 6 months to reassess, to show the child, the parent and the school it's all getting better. And that way you can move a child, hopefully, from something like autistic spectrum disorder or ADHD, these very serious problems, gradually through to, perhaps being just dyslexic or a bit forgetful, to eventually not being normal. We're not trying to make anybody normal. Eventually, what we want to see is those child's unique gifts coming out. That takes a while, but the beauty of edutherapy is it's not expensive. And the potential of edutherapy is that it would work best if you put it in a classroom. It costs no more to have a whole class of children on the edutherapy programme as it would if you had one individual child. And that's where we have to take it. That's my aim. We've got to do a bit of research in the meantime because we have to do a double-blind placebo-controlled trial to prove this works in the classroom. But that's where this stuff is going, and we need people's help. I'm talking to you tonight. I'd like you to tell other people. It's very difficult getting a new message out because everybody thinks that these problems are fixed. Nobody believes you can make the amount of change that we make. And people don't celebrate diversity because they can't really handle it. And we need a whole change in perception in so many different ways. And that's not easy to achieve. But we have to start with the people who first come across it. So you people are important. Edutherapy changes lives. And telling people about edutherapy can change a lot of lives. So I hope, if you like the message, do tell other people about it because it's important.